This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 45 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, November 6th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford in 1909. The first section of this issue is the About Town section. Elmer J. Whitney has been appointed by the Selectmen Inspector of Meat in place of Wilbert E. Parsons, resigned. Mr. Parsons has returned from a short visit to Newton, Maine, where the affections of earlier life repose in the cemetery, among whom are his first wife and 3 children, the latter all dying in 1 year. This visit was preparatory to leaving town for California and Oregon. Deer are holding camp meeting in the forest near Cold Spring and can be seen with the naked eye in the mowing fields that are close by. Give them a chance to eat a little old grass fog and don't for mere sport give aim with shotgun and dog. Mrs. David L. Grieg and Mrs. Alma Richardson started Monday for New York and New Jersey for a 2-week visit. If they expect to see all, hear all, and tell all in that time, it will be a busier 2 weeks than the berry season at the fruitful Grieg farm, with haying following as a close second. Reverend Seth Walker of the Walker Homestead on Main Street has opened a school for boys on Foster Street, Lowell, to be under the control of the Advent Society, of which Reverend Walker is the minister for Lowell. He holds out a wide open welcome to the people of his native town to attend services Saturday afternoons at Branch Street, Lowell. Unless the elements of nature and other unforeseen contingencies form a modern trust to prevent Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey will exchange with Reverend P.H. Creasy of Groton next Sunday. Odd age, has to guard carefully its promises of exchange, as the approaches to that season of the year are close by, when we shall be reminded of the words of Emerson, heralded by all the trumpets of the sky, arrives the snow. This quote is taken from Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem, The Snowstorm, which appeared in his 1847 book that was titled Poems. Mr. and Mrs. William Parfit have moved into the Talent Farm on Stony Brook Road. This is the farm of her uncle, the late Eben Talent. The Overlook Farm on the Tenney Road, North Westford, has not been overlooked in the distributions of nature, where crops are good and stones are plenty. The potato crop has been a regular Aroostook style, large and smooth, but free from machinery. That's a reference to Aroostook, Maine, which is big potato country. A recent digging unearthed 60 potatoes that weighed 75 pounds. This farm is owned by Fred L. Snow, recently of Lowell. Conundrum: if he can raise such potatoes as these without knowing how to farm, what will he raise when he does know? To be answered by Stony Brook potato raisers. Their answers are liable to be a sort of small potato affair of a half-century's gathered experiences. The next paragraph is called Gain in Valuation. The valuation of the town is still gaining, and we are becoming wealthy so gradually and so extensively territorially considered that we may not be aware of it unless figures are quoted. Here are a few out of the many thousand that the assessors have painted on the valuation books in red, black, and white, and they are all right. A total valuation of the town, May 1st, 1909, $1,833,214, a gain of $80,765 over 1908. Number of horses, 382, a loss of 16. Cows, 781, a gain of 30. Swine, 80, a loss of 70. Hens, 4,882, a gain of 1,600 137. Dwelling houses, 507, a gain of 3. Number of assessed poles, 690, a loss of 2. All other cattle commonly classified as neat stock, 206, a gain of 2. As usual, the rise was mostly in the manufacturing villages, which already pay over half of the taxes of the town. Those would be primarily Ford's Village and Graniteville. The next section is the Westford Center section. Diphtheria has made its much-to-be-dreaded appearance in the William E. Frost School. 2 of the children in the family of Joseph Sears are in quarantine with the disease. Mrs. Oscar R. Spaulding entertained the members of the Thimble Club and their husbands at Halloween whist Saturday evening. The scorecards were unique designs suitable to Halloween. Mrs. George W. Good made the highest lady score and received first prize, a dainty brooch. Brooch, I guess that is, a pin in Canadian design. The honors all went to the same family, Mr. Good securing the gentleman's prize, a particularly handsome pack of playing cards. Traditional Halloween refreshments were served during the evening, and later ice cream and cake were enjoyed by all present. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company held their regular monthly meeting at their headquarters Tuesday evening. The first supper of the season was served. This was an oyster supper and was in charge of J. Herbert Fletcher, Edward M. Abbott, and Aaron Tuttle. At the business session, the name of Frank E. Miller was proposed for membership. John Good was appointed second lieutenant in place of Albert Haywood, resigned from the company. A good representation of the membership went to Graniteville the night before to help at the Healy fire. More on that in a little bit. Mrs. David L. Grieg and Mrs. Alma Richardson are enjoying a trip of 10 days to New Jersey. They expect to visit Mrs. E.H. Bernhardt at Newark, Mrs. George E. Jenkins at Morristown, and Miss Martha J. Taylor at Bound Brook. Martha is the daughter of Samuel L. Taylor. Mrs. Charles P. Marshall and Marion have had a thoroughly enjoyable visit of a few days with their old friends and neighbors at their pleasant home in Grafton. During one day of their stay, Mrs. Sarah and Lillian Atwood, while on a business trip to Worcester, came out and spent several hours at Grafton. The Atwood sisters lived at 4 Graniteville Road, and Mrs. Marshall was the wife of the pastor of the Congregational Church in Westford Center. The Ladies' Missionary Society of the Congregational Church held a good meeting with Mrs. John B. Fletcher on Tuesday afternoon. Edward M. Abbott is off to the Maine woods for his annual hunting trip. Next paragraph is colds are very plentiful. Mrs. James Spinner is convalescing from a severe attack of bronchitis. Miss Edith Babbitt of the Academy Teaching Force was detained from the schoolroom 2 days last week with a hard cold. The next paragraph is called A Pleasant Home. Messrs. Needham and Fletcher have the house they have been building for Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher, widow of Charles Fletcher, who died in 1904, and her daughter Nellie, nearly ready for occupancy. This is probably the house that's at Two-Wheeler Lane now. Mrs. Fletcher expects to begin moving in within a few days. Nothing but the pleasantest comments have been heard from every side about this house since it began to take form and shape as a dwelling. It is delightfully located in the first place, being readily accessible to town hall, church, library, etc. It has the desirable southeasterly exposure and is placed so that the drainage is excellent, always ensuring a dry cellar. This lot on which the house is placed is what was known as the Pear Orchard, a part of the large farm which was Mrs. Fletcher's home for 37 years and was reserved by her at the time of the sale early last spring and it has made a most desirable building lot. The house is a model of convenience and comfort, every bit of floor space being planned to the best advantage, and while it is compact, the wide arched doorways and good lighting gives a spacious appearance. Outside, Mr. Tarbell, the landscape gardener, has laid out the ground in a way that gives a most excellent result. This home makes a pleasant addition to the village, and its new occupants have the best wishes of their many friends for the enjoyment of their pleasant home. The next section is entitled Entertainment. The first in the series of socials for the winter season at the Congregational Church last Thursday evening was a pleasant event and successful from the standpoint of a good social time and a creditable amount for the treasury. An oyster supper was served from 6:30 to 8 and was well patronized. Those who presided over this feature were Mrs. David L. Grieg, Mrs. Joseph E. Knight, and Mrs. Samuel L. Taylor. The dining room was decorated with autumn foliage, and the tables were brightened with the berries of the alder arranged with greenery. This was the deft handiwork of Mrs. Alfred W. Hartford. The entertainment at 8 consisted of a piano duet by Mrs. Marshall and Hazel Hartford, recitations by Oscar A. Nelson, duet Mrs. Cushing and Burnham, piano solo Sadie McMasters, readings by Samuel L. Taylor. Mr. Taylor regretted that his readings were ones that he had given before, but the applause he received must have convinced him that people liked his selections second-hand as well as some at first-hand. Later, there were games and singing around the piano. I would love to hear Samuel Taylor give his readings. Graniteville. The 9th anniversary dance, given under the auspices of Court Graniteville, Foresters of America, was held in Town Hall, Westford, on last Friday night and was a grand success. Kittredge's Orchestra of Lowell furnished excellent dance music, and at intermission, a fine oyster supper was served in the lower hall by caterer F.A. Smith. That's the third oyster supper reported in this issue of the Wardsman. There must have been a good buy on oysters that week. The affair was well attended, many being present from out of town. The following committee had charge: General Manager Edward Riney, Assistant A.R. Wall, Aides Fred Defoe, John Spinner, R.J. Herman, William Wright, Dr. C.A. Blaney, J.B. Riney, Lester McLenna, George McCarthy, J. Austin Healy, J.B. Healy, Henry Leduc, and Omar Leduc. Election day passed off very quietly here. Not a very heavy vote was cast, and the ticket was pretty well split up. The members of St. Catherine's Temperance Society will hold a social dance in Abbott's Hall, Ford's Village, on next Saturday night. The Sergeant School was closed on Friday of last week, as all the teachers were attending a teachers' convention in Boston. The next section is called Fire. What might have been a serious fire broke out shortly after 9 o'clock here Monday night, when the large barn belonging to J.A. Healy was completely destroyed by the flames. As it is, the loss on the building and contents will approach $5,000. The structure was a large affair, having a 50-foot frontage and a rear length of 100 feet. In it were 15 horses, 2 cows, several pigs, and many wagons and carriages. Several tons of hay and straw were also in the burned building. All the livestock and carriages were saved, but the barn and the hay and straw are a total loss. I believe Mr. Haley's primary business at the time was as a teamster, which would explain the horses and the carriages and wagons. How the fire started is unknown. It was discovered breaking through the roof over the harness room shortly after 9 o'clock by Fred Defoe and William Buckingham, who gave the alarm. Mr. Healy was returning from a firemen's meeting in the clubhouse when he heard the cry of fire. He soon found it was his own building his own barn blazing and hurried at once to the scene. Meantime, the neighbors had gathered and begun to take out the livestock. Notwithstanding the heat of the flames, they worked so quickly and so well that in a short time no living animal was left in the doomed building. Help was prompt in arriving. The A.R. Choate Hose Company of Graniteville, the John Edwards Company of Ford's Village, and the Edward M. Abbott Company of Westford responding within a short time, and did valiant work in staying the progress of the flames. The town water supply and hose equipment certainly paid for itself in this instance, and much credit is due to the fire department for their excellent work. The house and paint shop owned by Joseph Wall, but 20 feet from the burning structure, was saved by the firemen who poured tons of water on the house. The loss on the barn and contents is protected by insurance. This is the second loss sustained by Mr. Healy, whose house and barn were burned out 11 years ago last June. Fortunately, there was very little wind on Monday night, and the good work of the firemen and townspeople confined the flames to one building. The fire attracted a great number who stayed until the flames were under control, which was shortly after 11 o'clock, although watchers were kept all night. The next section is the Ford's Village section. After November 1st, J.B. Splain and Company and Hanley and Company will close their stores every Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 8 o'clock until further notice. Herbert Catchpole of Boston was a weekend guest at his brother Henry Catchpole. Communion services will be held at St. Andrew's Mission on Sunday, November 7th at 9 a.m., Sunday school at 3, evening service at 7. Next section is called Halloween Parties. The ladies of St. Andrew's Parish of Ayer entertained the choir of St. Andrew's Mission of this village at a Halloween party held at the vicarage in Ayer last Saturday evening. Supper was served at 6:30, and the 5 large tables were elaborately decorated in keeping with the day. Large pumpkins served as sugar bowls and butter dishes, while apples with centers removed and candles placed in them furnished the light. The waitresses were Salem witches and attired in white with pointed hats and brooms. They presented a ghostly appearance as they continually chanted verses in keeping with the occasion. The large room was beautifully decorated with autumn foliage, cornstalks, and grinning jack-o'-lanterns. After the supper was over, many games were played, which caused much laughter, following which a musical hour was enjoyed. Mrs. Christina and Teresa Lowther entertained a number of young people at a Halloween party last Saturday evening. The affair was given in honor of their nephew, Edwin Cherry of New York City, and Albert, who sailed Tuesday, November 2nd, for Liverpool, England, where he expects to spend the winter. An enjoyable ball is the title of the next section. The 18th annual ball of the Oddfellows was held in Abbott's Hall Wednesday evening, November 3rd, and proved to be a very enjoyable affair. Many guests were present from out of town. This ball is looked forward to as the leading event of the social season, and the committee in charge spared no expense to make it one long to be remembered. At 10:30, a chicken supper was served, after which dancing was resumed until 1 o'clock. The following committee had charge of the arrangements: General Manager Francis Lowther, Assistant Manager A.V. Nelson, Floor Director James Whigham, Aides Fred Davis, Henry Catchpole, William Baker, John Burnett, and George Weaver. Hibbard's Orchestra of Lowell furnished the music for dancing. The next couple paragraphs are titled Accident. While the John Edwards Hose Company was returning from the fire in Graniteville Monday night, the whiffletree broke, causing the heavy hose cart to swerve to one side. Captain Elmer E. Nutting was thrown out, and his leg received a severe sprain. John Carmichael, one of the regular men, jumped, but before he could clear the side of the wagon, it suddenly lurched back, throwing Mr. Carmichael on his head. Several stitches were necessary to close the wound. The accident was near the residence of Fred Reed, and only the fact that the driver, R.D. Prescott, clung to the reins and quieted the horses that a very serious accident was averted. Dr. Orion V. Wells was hastily summoned and attended both men. Neither injury proved serious, although the firemen admit it was a very close call. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending November 6, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.